There is a strange truth about avoidant people. The more you chase them, the more they disappear. But the moment you go silent, the moment you stop begging, stop explaining, stop proving your worth, that's when something shifts inside them. Not because you changed who you are, but because you finally removed your presence from their control. And in that silence, they start feeling something they never expected, your absence becoming louder than your words ever were. When you are dealing with an avoidant person, one of the most powerful dynamics at play is control through distance. It is not always obvious, but emotional control is often maintained by how much access you give to your feelings, your reactions, your availability, and your willingness to stay engaged, even when things feel confusing. In many cases, the avoidant individual becomes comfortable in a pattern where they decide when to come close and when to pull away, while the other person often ends up adjusting, explaining, waiting, or trying harder to reconnect. This creates an invisible imbalance where one person is emotionally leading and the other is emotionally reacting. When you are constantly present sending messages, asking questions, seeking clarity, or trying to fix emotional distance, you unintentionally reinforce that dynamic. You become predictable in your emotional response. The avoidant person starts to understand, even if unconsciously, that no matter how much they withdraw, there will still be effort from your side to breach the gap. This predictability gives them a sense of control, not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a psychological comfort zone where they can manage closeness on their own terms without feeling overwhelmed. However, something very different happens when you choose silence. Not silence as punishment, not silence as a tactic to provoke fear, but silence as a genuine withdrawal of emotional pursuit. When you stop chasing clarity from someone who is unwilling to provide it, when you stop explaining your worth to someone who keeps distancing themselves, and when you stop reaching out just to keep a connection alive, you disrupt the entire emotional pattern they have become used to. For the first time, they cannot predict your next move. They cannot assume you will always be available emotionally whenever they decide to return. This disruption is where their internal sense of control begins to shake. Avoidant individuals are often not as unaffected as they appear. Their calmness or emotional distance can sometimes be a protective layer rather than a lack of feeling. When that protective system is used to a certain rhythm, distance, return, reassurance, repeat your silence breaks that rhythm completely. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is something the avoidant mind does not process lightly. Even if they do not immediately show it, their mind begins to register the absence of your emotional pursuit. At first, they may interpret your silence as independence or disinterest. They might even convince themselves that nothing has changed, that you simply moved on or stopped caring. But over time, something subtle starts to happen. The emotional space you used to occupy does not get filled as easily as they expected. The attention they were used to receiving is no longer available on demand. The emotional safety net they relied on without fully acknowledging it begins to feel different, not because you are doing anything actively, but because you are no longer doing what you used to do. This is where control begins to shift, not because you are trying to take it away, but because you have stopped offering it freely. The avoidant person is now placed in a position where they no longer dictate the emotional timing of the connection. They have to sit with the absence of your reactions, your explanations, and your emotional availability. And in that space, curiosity slowly begins to grow. Not immediate longing, not instant realization, but curiosity about the change and pattern. Human psychology is deeply sensitive to patterns, and when a familiar emotional pattern is disrupted, the mind naturally tries to understand why. Your silence becomes more powerful than your words ever were, because it forces reflection instead of reaction. While words can be ignored, silence cannot be easily interpreted or controlled. It sits in the background of their awareness. It removes the comfort of assumption. It creates a gap where certainty used to exist, and in that gap, the avoidant person is no longer focused on how to maintain distance. Instead, they start becoming aware of the fact that something has shifted in the emotional environment they were used to controlling. But the most important truth in this entire dynamic is that silence does not work, because it is a strategy. It works because it restores balance. When you stop overextending yourself emotionally towards someone who is consistently withdrawing, you are no longer feeding an unequal system. You are no longer reinforcing a pattern where your effort is taken for granted. Instead, you step back into your own emotional space, where your presence is not dependent on their response. And in doing so, you unintentionally reveal something powerful. Your absence carries weight. Chairs. Not because you were trying to be powerful, but because you finally stopped giving away your emotional energy to a place where it was not being fully received. When someone is used to your constant emotional presence, they begin to unconsciously build a kind of stability around it. Your messages, your concern, your explanations, your attempts to understand them, all of that becomes part of their emotional background noise. They may not always respond deeply, and they may even seem detached or inconsistent, but your presence still plays a role in how their emotional world feels. It creates familiarity. And in psychology, familiarity often reduces awareness of value. This is why emotional absence has such a strong impact on avoidant dynamics. When you are consistently available, the mind stops actively registering your importance, not because you are unimportant, but because there is no contrast. The brain notices change more than consistency. When something is always there, it becomes part of the environment rather than something consciously appreciated. In relationships, this often leads to a subtle form of emotional neglect, not intentional, but habitual. However, when you step back and create distance, something important begins to shift. Your absence introduces contrast. Suddenly, the emotional environment is no longer stable in the same way. The messages stop. The reassurance is no longer immediate. The emotional availability they once took for granted is no longer accessible on demand. And in that silence, awareness starts to form. Not necessarily emotional attachment at first, but awareness of disruption. For an avoidant person, this awareness can be surprisingly intense, even if they do not show it outwardly. Avoidant individuals are often skilled at suppressing emotional dependence, but suppression does not mean absence of feeling. It simply means the feeling is not expressed or acknowledged directly. So when your presence disappears, what begins to surface is not immediate longing, but recognition of change. The mind starts to register that something familiar is missing from the routine they had grown comfortable with. This is where emotional awareness begins to develop. When you are always present, there is no space for reflection. But when you are absent, reflection becomes unavoidable. They may start noticing small things first: no messages from you, no check-ins, no emotional responses to situations where you would normally react. These small gaps accumulate into a larger realization. Your presence was more integrated into their emotional life than they consciously acknowledged. This process is not about manipulation or making someone miss you on purpose. It is about how human attention works. Tacy. We often only recognize the value of something when it is no longer immediately accessible. Emotional absence creates that distance between expectation and reality. The brain expects a response based on past behavior, but when that response does not come, it is forced to adjust. That adjustment is what creates awareness. For avoidant individuals, this awareness is often complicated. On one side, they value independence and emotional space. On the other side, they are still human beings who form attachments, even if they resist expressing them. So when your absence becomes noticeable, it does not immediately translate into open emotional expression. Instead, it often shows up as internal questioning. Why did things change? Why did the dynamic shift? Why is the other person no longer pursuing or reacting the same way? These questions are important because they represent the beginning of emotional reflection. Before someone can feel attachment, they must first recognize loss or change, and your absence creates that recognition. It forces them to mentally compare before and after. Before, there was emotional access, attention, and availability. After, there is space, silence, and unpredictability. That comparison slowly begins to reshape how they perceive your role in their emotional world. What makes this even more powerful is that absence removes emotional overload. Tacy. When you are constantly trying to reach someone emotionally, especially an avoidant person, they can sometimes feel overwhelmed or pressured, which leads them to withdraw further. But when you step back, the pressure disappears. And in the absence of pressure, the mind is free to process rather than defend. This is where real emotional awareness has a chance to develop. They begin to see you not as someone demanding attention, but as someone who has their own emotional boundaries. And paradoxically, that distance can make your presence more noticeable in memory. Not because you are actively doing anything, but because the emotional space you once occupied is no longer being filled in the same way. The contrast between presence and absence becomes the trigger for realization. Over time, this awareness can grow into deeper reflection. They may start remembering specific moments more clearly, especially moments where your presence provided emotional stability or care. Things that were once taken for granted begin to reappear in memory with more weight, not because the past has changed, but because their current emotional experience has changed. This is the foundation of emotional awareness created by absence. It is not instant, and it is not always expressed directly, but it is real. And it begins with one simple shift. When you stop being constantly available, you stop being emotionally invisible. Avoidant individuals are often seen as emotionally detached or unaffected, but what is usually misunderstood is that suppression is not absence, it is containment. When someone has developed an avoidant emotional pattern, they don't stop feeling, they learn how to push feelings down, delay them, rationalize them, or redirect them into logic instead of emotional expression. This creates a psychological structure where emotions exist, but they are kept under strict internal control. As long as their environment remains predictable and emotionally manageable, they can maintain that control without disruption. However, silence from someone they are emotionally used to changes that internal balance. When you are actively present, responding, explaining, caring, or trying to maintain connection, you are part of the emotional system they had built. Even if they acted indifferent, your presence provided a kind of emotional reference point. They could withdraw and return at will. They could regulate distance without fully confronting the emotional consequences of loss. But when you withdraw completely, that reference point disappears. This is where suppressed emotions begin to surface indirectly. Not as a sudden confession of feelings or immediate emotional breakdown, but as subtle internal discomfort. Avoidant individuals often experience emotions through secondary channels rather than direct emotional acknowledgement. Instead of saying, "I miss them," the mind might generate thoughts like confusion, irritation, restlessness, or unexplained curiosity. These are not random, they are emotional signals that are not being consciously accepted. Your silence forces them into contact with these signals. When there is no longer a predictable emotional interaction to engage with, the mind has more space to process what was previously avoided. And what was avoided is often emotional vulnerability itself, the fear of needing someone, the fear of dependence, the fear of loss of control. As long as you are present and emotionally available, those fears could be kept at a safe distance. But when you remove yourself, those fears begin to activate internally. This is why silence can feel emotionally intense for an avoidant person, even if they do not show it. They may appear calm externally, but internally they are dealing with emotional friction. The absence of your presence creates a gap that their usual coping mechanisms are not immediately able to fill. They might distract themselves, rationalize the situation, or convince themselves that nothing significant has changed. But emotions do not disappear just because they are rationalized away. Over time, the suppressed emotional content begins to rise slowly into awareness. This is not a dramatic emotional explosion, but a gradual resurfacing of what was previously pushed aside. Memories of interactions, moments of closeness, or even conflicts start to replay in their mind with a different emotional tone. What once felt neutral or manageable now carries a subtle weight because the present emotional environment has changed. Your absence plays a critical role in this process because it removes emotional buffering. When you were present, even inconsistently, there was always the option of reconnection. That option allowed emotional suppression to continue safely. But when silence becomes consistent, the mind is forced to confront permanence instead of temporary distance. And permanence is much harder for avoidant psychology to ignore. At this stage, they may not openly express emotions, but internal tension increases. They might feel a pull toward checking in, observing your activity, or re-establishing some form of connection, not necessarily out of clarity, but out of unresolved internal pressure. This is where suppressed emotion begins to influence behavior indirectly. They may act more curious, more attentive, or more reflective, even if they still resist emotional vulnerability. What is important to understand is that the emotions being surfaced are not new, they were always there. What has changed is the ability to ignore them. Silence removes external emotional noise and replaces it with internal emotional awareness. And when avoidance is no longer fully supported by external interaction, the internal system begins to process what it has been delaying. This can create a confusing experience for the avoidant person. On one hand, they value emotional distance and self-protection. On the other hand, your absence begins to activate emotional awareness they did not actively choose. This contradiction creates internal discomfort. They may not label it as missing you or wanting you back, but the emotional disruption is still present. The key truth is that suppressed emotions always seek resolution. They do not vanish, they wait. And silence, especially consistent emotional withdrawal, becomes the condition that allows those suppressed layers to slowly rise to the surface. Not because you are forcing it, but because the emotional system can no longer rely on constant external engagement to stay distracted. In that space, what was once buried begins to be felt, even if indirectly, and that is why silence often becomes more emotionally powerful than presence ever was. TARS. At the beginning of any emotionally charged dynamic with an avoidant person, there is usually a pattern that feels predictable from their side. They appear distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, and yet there is still a thread of connection that keeps the other person engaged. Even when they pull away, there is often an expectation, sometimes spoken, often unspoken, that the connection will continue in some form. This expectation becomes part of the emotional rhythm between both individuals. The avoidant person withdraws, the other person reaches, the avoidant person returns, the other person reconnects. Over time, this cycle becomes familiar, even if it is painful. But curiosity does not exist strongly in predictable environments. The mind is designed to conserve energy, and when outcomes become predictable, attention decreases. If someone knows that their withdrawal will always be followed by your return, there is little need for deep reflection on your absence. The emotional system becomes automated. However, when that pattern is disrupted, when the expected response no longer arrives, something very important begins to change. The brain is no longer able to rely on assumptions, and when assumptions break down, curiosity begins to form. When you enter silence, especially after a period of emotional engagement, you interrupt the psychological script they have become accustomed to. They may initially interpret it as temporary distance or emotional fatigue on your part. But as the silence continues without the usual emotional reaction from you, the predictability disappears. There is no message to respond to, no emotional signal to regulate, no clear indication of your next move. This absence of clarity creates a mental gap. The human mind naturally tries to fill gaps. It seeks explanations for changes in behavior, especially in relationships where emotional familiarity has been established. For an avoidant person, this gap is particularly impactful because their emotional system often relies on control through distance. When they can predict your emotional availability, they feel more in control of the situation, even if they are not consciously aware of it. But when your behavior becomes unclear or unresponsive, that sense of control weakens. At this point, curiosity begins to emerge, not necessarily as emotional longing, but as cognitive engagement. They start asking internal questions. Why did the dynamic change? Why is there no reaction? Did something happen? Did they lose interest? Did I lose influence over the situation? These questions are not always emotional at first. They are psychological attempts to regain understanding of a system that no longer behaves as expected. What makes this stage powerful is that curiosity is often the entry point to emotional reflection. Before someone can feel deeper attachment or emotional awareness, they must first become mentally engaged with the idea of loss or change. If everything feels stable and predictable, there is no reason for reflection. But when something familiar becomes uncertain, the mind begins to revisit it more frequently. In avoidant dynamics, this curiosity can feel uncomfortable. Avoidant individuals typically prefer emotional distance because it allows them to maintain a sense of autonomy and control. But curiosity disrupts that emotional distance. It pulls their attention towards something they were previously able to ignore or compartmentalize. Even if they try to dismiss it, the uncertainty keeps resurfacing in thought patterns. They may find themselves checking for signs of you indirectly, looking at your online presence, remembering past conversations, or replaying moments where your behavior felt different. Not because they are fully emotionally open, but because their mind is trying to solve a disruption in the emotional pattern. The absence of your reaction becomes a question they cannot easily answer, and unanswered questions naturally demand attention. This is where curiosity begins to replace indifference. What once felt emotionally manageable becomes mentally active. You are no longer just someone in the background of their emotional awareness. You become a point of unresolved attention. And unresolved attention is powerful because it does not allow the mind to fully disengage. Even if they resist emotional interpretation, the curiosity itself keeps the connection psychologically alive. The mind revisits what is incomplete. It replays what has changed. It analyzes what no longer fits the previous expectation. And in doing so, it slowly shifts your position in their awareness from something passive to something active. Importantly, this curiosity is not forced. It does not require you to act, explain, or chase. It is created by the absence of expected emotional feedback. When someone expects a reaction and receives none, their attention naturally intensifies toward the source of that disruption. Silence becomes noticeable not because it is loud, but because it breaks a pattern that was previously taken for granted. Over time, this curiosity can deepen. What begins as confusion can evolve into reflection. What begins as observation can evolve into emotional consideration. But it always starts with disruption. Without breaking the emotional pattern, curiosity rarely emerges. And without curiosity, deeper emotional awareness has no entry point. That is why silence, when it is genuine and rooted in self-respect rather than strategy, has such a strong psychological impact. It removes predictability, creates mental space, and allows curiosity to form naturally. And once curiosity is activated, the emotional narrative can no longer remain the same as before. When emotional effort is one-sided for a long time, it often becomes invisible to the person receiving it. Not because they are intentionally ignoring it, but because consistency creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces conscious recognition. When you are constantly available emotionally, mentally, or even physically in a relational sense, you slowly become part of the background of someone's emotional life. They expect your presence. They rely on your responses. They assume your availability will continue even when they are not actively investing the same level of energy in return. This is where a powerful psychological shift happens when you step back. Value in relationships is not only about how much someone gives, but also about contrast what is present versus what is absent. When you are always giving attention, care, and emotional presence, there is no contrast for the other person to measure your contribution against. It becomes the norm, and when something becomes the norm, the mind stops actively evaluating it. But silence changes that completely. When you stop overgiving, over-explaining, or over-initiating, the emotional environment changes. Suddenly, there is a gap where your effort used to be, and it is only when something is missing that its importance becomes visible. This is a basic principle of human psychology. Absence creates awareness of value more strongly than constant presence ever can. For an avoidant person, this realization often happens in layers. At first, they may not consciously interpret your reduced effort as significant. They might assume you are simply busy, distracted, or temporarily distant. But as the pattern continues and your emotional engagement does not return to its previous level, the contrast becomes undeniable. The emotional consistency they were used to is no longer there. This is where reevaluation begins. They start to mentally compare before and after. Before, there was consistent emotional availability, attention, and effort from your side. After, there is distance, silence, and reduced emotional access. This comparison naturally highlights what has changed, and in that comparison, your previous effort becomes more visible than it ever was while it was happening. What makes this stage particularly important is that it removes emotional entitlement. When someone becomes used to receiving effort without reciprocating at the same level, they are said to be in a state of equilibrium. They can unconsciously develop an expectation that the dynamic will remain stable, regardless of their own contribution. Your continued availability reinforces that expectation, but when you withdraw, that expectation is challenged. They no longer receive the same level of emotional input, without having to contribute more themselves or face the reality of imbalance. At this point, the value of your presence starts to become clearer, not because your worth has changed, but because the emotional contrast has changed. Humans are not always good at recognizing value in real time. They are much better at recognizing it in hindsight or absence. When you are no longer constantly there to absorb emotional tension, provide reassurance, or maintain connection, the impact of your absence becomes noticeable in daily emotional experience. They may begin to feel moments of discomfort they did not associate with you before. Situations that were once emotionally managed through your presence now feel slightly different. Conversations that used to include you now feel incomplete. Emotional regulation that was previously supported by your responses now feels less stable. These small shifts accumulate into a broader awareness. Something meaningful has changed in the emotional structure of the connection. This is also where memory becomes more active. The mind often replays past interactions with new interpretation when current conditions change. Moments where you showed care, patience, or emotional consistency begin to stand out more clearly. Not because those moments were forgotten, but because they are now being viewed through the lens of absence. What was once taken for granted starts to feel more significant in reflection. For avoidant individuals, this process can be particularly complex because they often do not acknowledge emotional dependence easily. Instead, they may rationalize the change. They might tell themselves that distance is good, that independence is preferable, or that emotional detachment is healthier. But underneath those rationalizations, the reevaluation is still occurring. The emotional contrast is still being processed, even if it is not openly expressed. Your reduced effort forces a recalibration of their expectations. They begin to understand, sometimes slowly, sometimes reluctantly, that your presence was not as passive as it seemed. It had structure, consistency, and emotional contribution. And now that it is reduced, the imbalance becomes more apparent than before. This does not automatically lead to immediate reconnection or emotional expression, but it does change perception, and perception is the foundation of emotional value. When someone starts to perceive your presence as something that was actively contributing to their emotional stability, rather than something that simply existed in the background, your value shifts in their internal framework. The important truth here is that value is not created by absence alone, it is revealed by it. Your worth was never dependent on withdrawal. Instead, withdrawal simply removes the noise that previously made your contribution less visible. In silence, what remains is clarity. And in that clarity, your emotional presence becomes something that can no longer be easily ignored or assumed. That is why stepping back often leads to reevaluation. Not because you are doing more, but because you are finally not doing everything. Silence is often misunderstood as a tactic to get someone's attention back, especially in emotionally intense situations involving avoidant dynamics. But in its healthiest and most powerful form, silence is not about control over someone else, it is about restoration of control over yourself. The moment you begin to step back from constant emotional pursuit, explanations, overthinking conversations, and trying to fix a connection that is not being equally held, something fundamental starts to shift internally. You begin to return to yourself. Many people stay emotionally overinvested in avoidant dynamics because they are trying to earn consistency from inconsistency. They keep adjusting their behavior, lowering their emotional needs, or increasing their effort in hopes that the other person will eventually meet them halfway. But this creates a slow erosion of self-respect. Your emotional energy becomes tied to outcomes you cannot control, and your sense of value becomes dependent on another person's ability or willingness to respond. Silence interrupts that cycle, not because it magically changes the other person, but because it stops you from abandoning yourself in the process of trying to reach them. When you stop chasing responses, stop over-explaining your feelings, and stop trying to prove your worth to someone who is emotionally inconsistent, you create space. And that space is not empty, it is the beginning of emotional recovery. At first, silence can feel uncomfortable because it removes the activity that your mind has become used to. If you have been emotionally engaged in thinking about them, waiting for replies, analyzing their behavior, or hoping for clarity, then stepping back creates a sense of withdrawal, not from them, but from the emotional habit itself. The mind resists this change because it is used to constant stimulation, but over time something important happens. Your focus begins to return inward. You start noticing things you were previously ignoring: your own emotional needs, your own boundaries, your own exhaustion. You begin to realize how much energy was being spent on trying to maintain a connection that was not emotionally balanced. And that awareness is the beginning of self-respect. Not the kind that is declared loudly, but the kind that is felt quietly when you stop abandoning your own emotional stability for someone else's unpredictability. This is why silence is not just a relational shift, it is an identity shift. You move from being someone who reacts emotionally to every change in their behavior to someone who observes without losing themselves in the reaction. That shift is powerful because it restores emotional independence. You are no longer emotionally outsourcing your stability to someone who is inconsistent with your needs. And here is where something deeper happens. When you reclaim your emotional space, your perception of the situation changes. Tay, what once felt urgent starts to feel different. The need to constantly understand, fix, or decode their behavior loses intensity. Not because you stop caring, but because you start valuing your own emotional peace equally, if not more. Avoidant dynamics often trap people in a loop where they believe that if they just try harder, wait longer, or understand deeper, things will eventually stabilize. But silence breaks that illusion. It forces you to confront a simple truth. Effort alone cannot create emotional reciprocity. You cannot single-handedly build mutual connection with someone who is not consistently participating in it. And that realization is where true growth begins. Because instead of continuing to invest energy into trying to control an outcome, you begin to redirect that energy back into yourself. You start rebuilding focus on your goals, your emotional health, your friendships, your interests, and your personal direction. Slowly, your identity stops revolving around their responses. This is the real power of silence. It returns ownership of your emotional life to you. You are no longer waiting for validation to feel okay. You are no longer measuring your worth through someone else's inconsistency. You begin to understand that your emotional stability cannot depend on someone who is not stable in giving it back. Ironically, this is also where your presence becomes more powerful, even if you are not trying to be powerful. Because when you are no longer emotionally chasing, your energy changes. You are no longer coming from desperation or emotional urgency. You are coming from groundedness, and groundedness is far more impactful than pursuit. But the most important part is that silence teaches you something about self-respect that no emotional conversation ever could. You learn that you do not need to overextend yourself to be worthy of love, attention, or consistency. You learn that your emotional needs are valid even when someone else does not meet them. And you learn that stepping back is not losing someone, it is refusing to lose yourself. That is why silence is not the end of connection with others. It is the beginning of reconnection with yourself.